Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Our two subjects tonight both had the most important events of their professional lives occur in 1961, and we're going to concentrate on those. The first is Oleg Ivanovsky, who died at the age of 92. And Oleg Ivanovsky was one of the leading Russian rocket scientists of the early Russian space program. On this program, we've concentrated before on the American space program in the 1950s and 60s, but not so much on the Russian space program, which was actually ahead of the American program until about 1964. Oleg Ivanovsky was the engineer who accompanied the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, up to the capsule Vostok 1 in April of 1961. Here's Julian Warwicker of The Last Word from BBC4 to talk about Oleg Ivanovsky.
The rocket scientist Oleg Ivanovsky worked at the heart of the Soviet space program in the late 1950s and early 1960s, at a time when it was politically as well as astronomically so important. He oversaw the construction and launch of the craft which carried Yuri Gagarin into space. But prior to that, he was the assistant designer of Sputnik, the world's first man-made satellite launched in October 1957. Asif Siddiqui, professor of history at Fordham University in New York, has studied the Soviet space program of that era.
He was basically involved in turning the drawings into the actual satellite. So you might say he was one of the people who was really close to Sputnik during its final days of preparation.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik.
And it mattered not just in terms of space exploration at the time, did it not? But it also mattered in political terms.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I don't think you can really overestimate the impact Sputnik had globally, but especially in the West in terms of perception of the Soviet Union at the time.
But that changed, did it not, when President Khrushchev, as it was at the time, realized the propaganda value of spaceflight and wanted Sputnik 1 to very quickly become Sputnik 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the first Sputnik is launched on October 4th, and literally within a month, I think it was November 3rd, they had a second one up. And that was because Khrushchev very quickly realized the political spectacle of all this, and so he ordered his engineers to do another one, so to speak. And the engineers offered up the idea of putting a dog into space, and that's what they put together. And Ivanovsky was also involved in that one too, actually.
Take us on then to 1961 and Yuri Gagarin. Again, what was Ivanovsky's role there?
Well, that was a bit more important. He had been promoted from an assistant to the actual lead designer. So he was in charge of building and constructing the actual spaceship that launched the world's first man into space. So in a way, he was really intimately involved in such an amazing, grand historical event.
I lost track of that night as it gradually blended with dawn. Normally I would have woken up in the morning and headed for the launch site. But that night I didn't sleep, needless to say.
He was actually there on the launch day, so he was there escorting Gagarin up to his spaceship at the launch pad, and you can see these wonderful color films now that remain of that day. Ivanovsky looking quite young and quite excited about this event, leading Gagarin to the ship. So there was probably no one who was closer to the Gagarin flight than Ivanovsky.
I take Gagarin by the hand and take him to a ladder leading to the lift. About 15 steps separate him from the lift.
Roughly, this was a 50-50 chance of success here, and there's quite a bit of probability that this would have ended in a tragedy, and so they were taking a huge risk.
My understanding of it was that the flight was to be fully automatic, but there was a 3-digit security code that Gagarin had to use to effectively override the controls.
There was some concern when a human being goes into space, they might go insane or lose their faculties, so they put this code in an envelope and sort of hid it away in the ship, and they would transmit the code to Gagarin when they knew that he was okay. But it turns out, of course, the story goes that while on his way to the rocket, Ivanovsky whispered the code into Gagarin's ear. So much for that.
The thinking being, presumably, that Gagarin had quite enough to think about, and at least having that to hand would be helpful.
Yes, exactly.
Ivanovsky's been described as one of the last remaining scientists who witnessed the complete Soviet space program from within. How significant a figure do you think he has been?
I think he is important, but probably not one of the giants. But in the one way I think his legacy is important was he was very intimately involved in these missions. There is really nobody, I think, like Ivanovsky left alive today who was involved with Sputnik and Gagarin to the extent that he was. He was really the person who might have, remembered and recalled, I was there. So I think in that sense he may be the last of a generation.
To review some of the differences between the American and the Russian space program, while the Americans had some great engineers, their space program was primarily put together by Germans they had captured after World War II, the Germans who were responsible for the V-2 rocket. V-2 rocket was essentially the first ICBM, and the leading German scientist was, of course, Wernher von Braun, who took nominal control of the American space program. The Russians captured some German rocket scientists too, although many of them simply defected to the Russians. They were never critical to the Russian program. The Russians kept control of their own program. Many of the Germans got disaffected later on. The leading Russian engineer, Ivanovsky's boss, was Sergei Korolev. He was the genius of Russian rocket science, probably the greatest rocket scientist in the world. And he was essentially the mastermind behind Sputnik, the person who Khrushchev looked to. Sputnik was, of course, a big deal, and in case you're wondering where the first American to orbit the Earth later on was on October 4th, 1957, he was on Name That Tune. Here it is, John Glenn talking about Sputnik. This is years before he had any idea he'd go into space.
And now back tonight and trying for $20,000 are Eddie Hodges, the 10-year-old schoolboy, and his partner, Major John Glenn Jr., the Marine Corps jet pilot. What do you think of the Russian satellite, which is circling the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour?
Well, to say the least, George, they're out of this world. But this is really quite an advancement for not only the Russians, but for international science. I think we all agree on that. It's the first time anybody has ever been able to get anything out that far in space and keep it there for any length of time. And this is probably the first step toward space travel or moon travel, something we'll probably run into maybe in Eddie's lifetime here at least.
Eddie, would you like to take a trip to the moon?
No, sir, I like it fun right here.
Eddie Hodges became a minor rock and Broadway star in his own right. Anyway, with Gagarin's flight in 1961, the Russians were clearly ahead of the Americans. They sent up Vostok 2 with German Titov. The Russians landed on ground as opposed to the sea where the Americans landed. The Americans then started their orbital space program with Mercury. Alan Shepard went up, then Glenn circumnavigated the world. The Russians sent up a woman, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and they were ahead, but they were plagued by several problems. They had problems landing their spacecraft. There was a big alcohol problem in the Russian space program, and Korolev was becoming physically ill. Korolev died in 1966, and with him died any hope that the Russians would beat the Americans to the moon. After Korolev died, the Russians simply didn't have the money or the technical manpower to match the Americans, and Gagarin died a world hero in 1968 in a mysterious plane crash. Oleg Ivanovsky was probably one of the last people alive who could relate firsthand the details of the Soviet space program from its inception and how it impacted the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. We're going to move on now to Don Keefer, who died recently at the age of 94. He was an American actor. He was the last surviving member of Elia Kazan's production of Death of a Salesman with Lee J. Cobb. He was in a lot of movies. He was in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He had a starring role in a neat TV show that only lasted about 5 episodes called Way Out that was hosted by Roald Dahl. But by far, Don Keefer's most famous role in television was in one of the most famous television shows of all time, one of the classic episodes of The Twilight Zone called It's a Good Life. It aired in November of 1961, about 6 months after Gagarin's flight. It starred John Larch and Cloris Leachman, but the real star was Billy Mumy as an 8-year-old who could read people's thoughts and wish them into the cornfield. And one of the people he wished into the cornfield was Don Keefer. Don Keefer got a little drunk, he got a birthday present, he got a little upset with Billy Mumy, and Billy Mumy wished him into the cornfield. But before he did, in one of the most famous television scenes in history, Billy Mumy turned Don Keefer into a jack-in-the-box, and that's what he got his fame for. Many people have called that the greatest Twilight Zone episode of all time, and that sequence with Don Keefer as the most memorable part of that episode. Here it is, take a listen.
And blue.
Monster, you dirty little monster. You murderer. You think about me. Go ahead, Anthony. You think bad thoughts about me. And maybe some man in this room, some man with guts, somebody who's so sick to death of living in this kind of place and willing to take a chance, will sneak up behind you and lay something heavy across your skull and end this once and for all.
You're a bad man. You're a very bad man.
You think that? Go ahead, Anthony. I'm a very bad man. Keep thinking that. Somebody sneak up behind him. Somebody end this now. But he's thinking about me. Won't somebody take a lamp or a bottle or something and end this?
You're a bad man. You're a very bad man. And you keep thinking bad thoughts about me.
Wish it into the cornfield. Please, son, wish it into the cornfield, please.
He was a bad man, so I turned him into a jack-in-the-box. A jack-in-the-box that still had his bad face.
I gotta tell you, my wife heard me preparing this tape. She still gets creeped out hearing that 50 years later. Here's Billy Mumy today talking about that episode of The Twilight Zone.
Why do you think that episode resonates with people?
Because it's great. Because everyone in the cast is just so good. John Larch and Cloris Leachman, and forgive me for forgetting some of Max Schumwalter, and it's based on a great story by Jerome Bixby and a teleplay by Rod Serling, and it scares the out of you. And it's black and white, and that most of the special effects are left to your imagination, which I think is great about The Twilight Zone. There are episodes of The Twilight Zone where, okay, here's the mask and here's the thing. And I think those are weaker than the ones where your own mind has to play. You know, when Anthony turns him into a jack-in-the-box, you just basically see a shadow. You know, you see a beat of that head, but it's mostly left to your imagination, and the choices there were just great. I mean, TV Guide called It's a Good Life one of the best 100 shows of television, which is a very, it's nice. It's not going to get you pizza, but it's still nice. It's very flattering to be a part of something like that.
Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Taps, and it's very rare in one of these podcasts that the character actually tells me what the closing song should be. If you're wondering what upset Billy Mumy so much with Don Keefer in It's a Good Life, well, here it is. Turns out it was Perry Como records. You know, Anthony might have had a point.
Go ahead, Ethel. Give your hubby the big surprise.
What's this? Perry Como. Well, I haven't heard Perry Como in years and years. Look, do you think we could play it? Gosh, what I'd give to hear some new music. Well, just the first part. The orchestra part. Before Como sings.
I don't think we'd better, Dan. After all, we don't know just where the singing comes in. It'd be taking too much of a chance. Better wait till we get home.
It's good I can't play it here.
Oh, yes, it's good. It's very good.
It would be good if you told me what to play, Anthony. It would be real good if you'd tell me what music you'd like to hear.
Just play. Play anything.
All right. I'll play, I'll play Moonglow. That's a nice old tune.
Oh, that's a nice tune. Oh, yes, that's a very good tune.
Don't make any noise when the music's playing. I don't like any noise when the music's playing.
All right, Anthony, it's my show. We're doing a tribute to Don Keefer. Let him hear his Perry Como. I don't like it either. Just don't send me into the cornfield.
It must have been moonglow way up in the blue. It must have been moonglow that led me straight to you.
And you mustn't think bad thoughts about me either, or I'll do the same thing to you.